I think, Darren, you're driving the slides today. So again, I think a big warm Telmo welcome to Darren and Lucy, who are going to take us through this session. So over to you both. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I will say hello and welcome while Darren's putting some slides up. Hello to everybody, and good afternoon if you are based as we are in the UK. Good evening, good night, good morning, variously if you are not. And welcome to our session, which, despite the title, will not be us giving you a lecture on how you should or should not behave, as we definitely should not. But we are here to talk about some fairly deep and tangled issues around ethics for mathematics teachers, which is part of a book chapter that we recently published together. Oh, your slides have gone off.
They just disappear. I wonder what that is.
Yeah.
Let me try again.
Thank you. And Darren and I are speaking to you from roughly the Cambridge area and on behalf of the University of Cambridge. There we go, there's the title. Okay, do you want to go to the introduction slide? So as is traditional, I will introduce Darren and he will introduce me. Darren is, and you'll see why, because he doesn't like to say that he has expertise in things, so it is problematic in this sort of situation. Darren's an expert in statistics education and also teacher professional learning and also assessment. We are both roughly at the same stage of our PhD, which is the end's in sight. Don't ask any more questions. And Darren's PhD relates teacher professional learning assessment and statistics education, those three specialisms. Over to you.
Thank you. Yes, Lucy, as has already suggested, is about the same stage as me in the PhD. I mean, that was very generous. Lucy is far, far ahead of me in terms of writing up the PhD, and I am looking wistfully in her direction and wishing I'd done as much writing and was as close to completing. Lucy's PhD is predominantly focused on knowledge brokering, but looking at some really interesting aspects of knowledge brokering through, in particular, less formal, traditional and more artistic methods. And I would urge you, if you get a chance to have a look at any of Lucy's work on that, particularly the songs and singing research, then do take advantage of that. But yes, also a very regular speaker, contributor on maths education in panels, on TV occasionally and on radio occasionally too.
Thank you. So we come to speak to you today with no particular expectation as to whether you think there should or shouldn't be ethics in mathematics. And we mean mathematics, not maths education. If you could pop onto the next slide, that would be lovely, thank you. And we, I think it's fair to say, didn't necessarily have a very settled position on this either some time ago. But as part of the work that I did at university with the Ethics for Mathematicians Society, and then through meeting Maurice, who was the professor that would put together that programme, and therefore speaking to a few other people, including Dennis, who was the other person who co-wrote with us, I started to think in more detail about these issues, and I spoke to Darren about them regularly. And we started to connect some of the literature on needing ethics for mathematicians to needing ethics for maths teachers. And you'll see here that there's some interesting literature out there, which is essentially saying that mathematicians, without attending to ethics, but also being able to discuss ethics, perhaps even having an organisation, an institution, professional bodies that support them in considering ethics, are leaving themselves open to their work being used for potentially harm as well as good. And perhaps the worst part of that is they might not know about it. And so there's some lovely literature on ideas of ethics in mathematics for mathematicians. And then, as I say, because I was involved in doing some work with undergraduates at Cambridge, I started to think about how this could be applied lower down in terms of schooling, secondary schooling, primary schooling, and how this might affect maths teachers. Over to you, Darren.
So, I'm pressing the button and nothing's happening. There we go. So, if we could then start off just by taking a moment, I guess, to set the scene and to set the space here a little bit. As Lucy has said, we aren't trying to come here with all the answers. So our aim within this talk is really to share some ideas with you from the chapter. A little bit more on that in a second, but also to give you a space to start thinking about some of these issues and thinking in particular how they sit with you, and perhaps beginning some discussions and sharing some ideas around that. So just first of all, I'll leave this on the screen for a moment, and I'd invite you all just to have a quick read, and invite you just to think about whether the mathematics that we deliver collectively at the moment, that you deliver in your classrooms, is doing what this quote says for students, and how you feel about that, whether positive or negative or either way. Now, we are going to be keeping an eye on the chat throughout this talk. We're going to pause midway through just to have a look and see if there's anything that's kind of bubbling up in the chat that would be interesting to address or talk around further. So please do make extensive and judicious use of the chat. You know, if you think of anything, if you have a response to any of the things that we say, put it in the chat, you know, discuss with each other while this is going on. And if there are some themes and threads that bubble up out of that would be interesting to divert into a little bit, then we'll take some time to do that through the talk. So on to the chapter itself. So as Lucy said already, she was very much the driving force behind this chapter that we put together. And I contributed because of my statistics expertise, which has already been referred to as an interesting site of ethical considerations with maths, and perhaps one of the more obvious sites of ethical consideration, which we'll come to later on. But Lucy was predominantly the driving force behind this chapter. The chapter itself is in this book, Ethics and Maths Education, which was published in recent months. I have no conception of the passing of time at this point, so it could have been a month ago, it could have been 6 months ago, but recently. But there is a link on the screen there for anyone who wishes to see the preprint version of the chapter that we were able to make available. So we'll put that in the chat at some point too. So what we will do to begin with then is to talk about the focus of this chapter, which is a framework for ethics for maths teachers that we expanded on from some previous work that was done by one of the co-authors. We'll look at the stages of that framework. We'll take a pause, and then we'll talk in a bit more detail about some specific examples that we want to draw your attention to. But this is the basis of what we're talking about today, and we would invite you to read that if interested after the talk. So on that note, back to you, Lucy.
Thank you so much. I know a comment in the chat, which is common for people to think maths is about fundamental truths and inherently unbiased and without ethical concerns. And I really enjoy the response to that, as how would an evil supervillain use this? Is always a fun way to disprove it.
I kind of feel like we can go home now.
Right?
Our work is done.
I think we should let Laura do the rest of the talk. Yeah. You sound like you absolutely know your stuff, Laura. And that's exactly the point we're about to make. So there are originally in this framework, which again was for mathematicians, and we're extending that to maths teachers. Of course, we are not suggesting you have to be one or the other. There's a lot of overlap. The idea was originally that we had this level 0, which was there's no ethics in maths or maths education. And one of the things that I decided that might be nice to change about this was a level -1. So I'm not even sorry. But there is something about neutrally believing there's no ethics in maths activity that's different to actively obstructing efforts to address it, that I thought was important to draw out. Thank you, Laura. I love seeing level -1 as well. And so this is one of the things that we encouraged people to consider. I think this idea that maths is free, pure, neutral, apolitical, value-free, these are the sorts of things I say constantly in my research in order to trouble them, and certainly cannot be used for harm, is very, very important to put on the table as let's scrutinise and challenge this. Again, we're not here to tell you one way or the other how to think, but I think it's a very common view, and quite often just passed down from person to person, and quite often with some positives. So mathematics is certain, mathematics contains truth. None of these things we're debating necessarily all the time, but there are some corollaries, which is that, as we've said, ethics doesn't belong in mathematics or mathematics teaching, that we have no values inherent in maths or maths teaching, and we're here to trouble some of those ideas and to sort of dig into them a bit further. And the idea that people might be obstructing efforts to address ethics in the maths classroom or dissuading peers or students from thinking about that, I think is something that Darren and I have come across in practice. And we encourage you to consider whether that's something you've seen happening. And I think there is a wide range of opinion on this issue, it's true to say. And that's something that we wanted to sort of gather together, collate, and start to think about in a bit more of a structured way. So the question being, what might this look like in practice? So if Darren moves on to the next slide, we again tried to collect the sorts of things you might hear that we think exemplifies this level. So for level -1, we have heard and continue to hear things like this. These sorts of lessons belong in other subjects, not mathematics. Stop asking silly questions. I'll let you know who you might think that's addressed to, and focus on the real mathematics. Do you actually think algebra can kill people? Somebody did ask me that one once. Stop misbehaving and get back to the mathematics lesson, and then that's not real mathematics. So again, this artificial construct of here's real maths, and over there we've got things that are to do with ethics. And as Darren says, an interesting facet of that might be that wherever you are on that spectrum, some people might consider statistics real mathematics and some people might not. I'm not going to address that right now. I'll leave that to my esteemed colleague. So to the next slide, where we look at level 0. And again, what it might look like or what you might hear. So this is believing there's no ethics. And again, people might have very good intentions here. I got into mathematics for the right and wrong, black and white, not this stuff. I'm not interested in it. And I'm also sort of actively trying to put it again in a different space, because this is the stuff that I love to do. And that fundamentally changes what maths or maths education might be for me. Mathematics isn't about being human. It's transcendental, universal, and beautiful. And again, these sorts of views are espoused often. It doesn't necessarily mean you have to agree with them. Mathematics is just the tool, very interesting. And then mathematics is truth and truth is beauty. This is a misquote of Keats, which was on the wall of my maths classroom when I was a student. Over to you, Darren.
And there is some bits and pieces that are bubbling along in the chat, which are really interesting to see people's thoughts on this. So obviously, Lucy just shared the first, the initial 2 levels of this framework, which are focused on the idea of I say, maths is separate from ethical consideration somehow, and either you can disengage from ethics or you can actively obstruct the inclusion of ethics within it. So now we're moving on to the kind of the foothills of consideration of the ethics in maths framework, and I'll pass back to Lucy when we get to kind of base camp and onto the next stage. I'm working on using metaphors in talks. So this is kind of the early stages. This is the part where I think an awful lot of people are at, which is that they're certainly aware that there's some relationship between ethics and ethical considerations and maths, but maybe the link is not quite there, or maybe the understanding of it is as there are instances within maths and maths education where ethics might be relevant, but really for the most part it's not everywhere, and it's in these kind of specific cases, and it's not pervasive and so on. So we have these next 2 levels, the first being to realize that there are ethical issues that can be considered within mathematics, and then to the next stage, just beginning to do something about it, and maybe not feeling particularly empowered, not feeling like those ideas about where ethics sits and why that's important to you as a teacher, maybe not feeling those things particularly strongly, but just starting to prod away at these ideas. So thinking about some tasks, thinking about some context that could maybe be brought in that just start to, perhaps as an enrichment or an additional activity, attend to ideas of ethics without it being kind of fundamental to maths teaching and maths education. It's an extra consideration. So again, to think about the particular instances of the kind of things that people say around this, acknowledging that maths has an impact in the real world. We're doing all this stuff in the classroom, but in the real world, maths is used in various different ways that can have impact and can have ethical implications. The idea that we shouldn't do harmful things in maths, and harm is a particularly interesting idea because how you define harm is important and significant. And one question perhaps to ask is, if we have a world where people go through the maths education system and they come out with huge anxiety around doing maths, a lack of confidence, a belief that they themselves are not really mathematicians, where does that sit on the spectrum of harm, and how is that related to teaching practices and ethical practices within maths education? Statistics, again, we've talked about it a few times, but it is one of the ones where it is a really simple and easy site to think about implications of how data is collected, how data is used, and so on. And we'll talk about those a little bit later. And then moving up to the next level of starting to do something about it. There is this idea floating about that perhaps we're at a stage now where maths needs some kind of version of the Hippocratic Oath, because it's so
in the interest of crediting people for their ideas. Hannah Fry.
Thank you. I was going to get to that. Hello World. Not Hello
maybe,
World.
But also in various articles. She's definitely not the first to come up with it, but has been widely credited for it.
But yeah, so this idea that, well, if maths is used and abused in so many different ways, and there are so many books starting in weapons of maths destruction, Hello World, to name two. You can do the author name of the first one for me.
Maths Babe.
Sure.
Cathy O'Neill is the person.
That's it, Cathy O'Neill. This idea that actually maybe there's a kind of mathematician do no harm thing that is fundamental that we're somehow missing, where maths is treated as cold, hard, rational and pure and beautiful, and we can create these algorithms, we can do all of these things with maths, and we don't have to think about the consequences, because it's kind of fun to do the maths and see where the maths leads us, and it's for other people then to decide what the implications of those decisions are. And again, some other examples through here of just starting to think about tasks, instructions, activities, displays, things that could be done in school that may be product ethics, but aren't fundamental to necessarily the day-to-day activities of classroom practice. And so I shall hand back to Lucy now at the foothills to take us on to the summit of the framework.
Just a quick question.
I'm running with it.
In this metaphor, are you on my back at this point?
Probably, yeah.
Great.
Riding on your coattails.
Yeah. If you'd like to, thank you, move on. So you might be thinking at this point, well, how many more levels can there be? We're already committed to doing something and understanding that there are ethics inherent in maths and maths education. I think the doing something for us needed a bit of teasing out, because the first protocol, as you saw in level 2, was maybe creating things. So as Darren said, almost like an add-on, creating some resources, thinking about tasks, starting to have some conversations, creating some discourse. But actually, there's further levels for us that start to get at the complexity of this issue a little more. And one of them is to not just write ethical tasks, but pose and expose ethical dilemmas. And here we have taken, again, some interesting research from others, including Gutierrez, who really writes beautifully about the thing that I can't pronounce, political conocimiento, which is about, thank you, the way that we as teachers, and specifically maths teachers, and that's interesting too, interact with students in ways that protect them from the system. And there's an embedded assumption there, which I find very interesting, that students in mathematics classrooms are often not being well served by the systems around them. They require advocacy, they require protection, and sometimes they require us to do things which we might not consider in line with what we're being asked to do from elsewhere. There is a tension there, and that's a really interesting ethical thing to start to undo. So it isn't just about the teaching resources now. This has started to become about who we are as maths teachers. If we have a student, for example, who hasn't completed their maths homework by a certain time, and we're reporting that to our superior, and the student comes to us and talks to us about why they haven't done that and explains what they need and the kind of support, is there a sense in which we should now buffer that that reporting by a mediated discussion with our superior about why that hasn't happened, rather than just saying, yes, put them in detention with the others. You know, all of these decisions happen every day for us as maths teachers. Equally, we have students who need help. We have students who cheat. We have students who do things that we consider would be breaking the rules, but sometimes for reasons that we totally understand. And those are really important things to start to understand and unpick as teachers. And the reason this is about mathematics specifically is it has that reputation, as I said, of being neutral, value free. And many, many people think that using data is a straightforward exercise that involves no interpretation and no human judgment. And of course, Darren and I would argue the opposite of that. And so what happens is your mathematics learners get this rich, structured discussion. They also start to feel safe and they belong. So what's interesting is it doesn't just have an effect on the mathematics you do, but the environment you produce. And the classroom climate is key to this. I think we've all maybe had or chaired discussions about things that are complicated and people don't want to contribute. And there's silence and there's uncomfortableness. And it's not that the topic doesn't deserve attention, it's that the climate isn't right yet. And that's super important. And then level 4, and bad mathematics was not my wording, but calling out. So we actively stand up and we critique. And what we do by critiquing is not try and just be negative and build everything down, but also offer alternatives. Try and centre narratives of those who are minoritized, try and make space in that silence for other voices. All of this stuff is crucial. And the effect that would have for our students is huge. They start to have access to mathematics differently. And we've put here for empowerment, justice and belonging because it really, really matters. We understand the practice of mathematics as crucial to democracy, justice, fairness, a host of other processes by which we all exist in the world. And we're not just saying everyone needs to know how to solve an equation. We're saying everyone needs to feel like they belong in a mathematics classroom. I could go on forever, but I won't. So I'm going to stop there. Darren, would you like to add anything to that?
No, the main thing for me, I think you've touched on it a little bit already, but I think it's really important at this point to acknowledge the idea that there is something that happens between the sort of level 1, 2 part and the level 3, 4 one, which is that as a person trying to act ethically and trying to move from that, you know, level 1, level 2 to level 3, level 4, there is risk and cost attached to it, to the individual, because in those lower levels, it's a very personal choice that you can make, and it's not challenging systems, it's not challenging people outside of your classroom potentially. It's, you know, what are the small things I can do within the classroom, within my practice that I have control over, that can start to attend to some of this stuff. But to take that step to really push back, to challenge things, to try and make systemic changes, or to push back against structures within schools, within classrooms, where it's you bringing this into a community and bringing potentially an alternative perspective into a community. There is a risk and there is a cost to that. And some institutions that will be higher or lower, some places will be more supportive, some groups of people will be more supportive or more engaged. But I think any discussion around actions that people take as individuals, or to try and move other people and move people's thinking along, there is a risk, there is a cost, there is an energy that you have to put into it, and parts of yourself that you have to give to that, that can be very exposing at times. And I don't think it's reasonable to have this kind of conversation without acknowledging that reality, not just in this instance, but
and as a corollary to that, we're not suggesting there's a moral imperative to do this for everybody all the time. What we are suggesting is exactly as Darren says, there's a cost, and ultimately your level of privilege in this area is how much you can get away with doing this. And that's important to think about. You don't always have to do anything about it, but that's important to think about. So, yeah, sorry, this is still me, isn't it? So in terms of what this could look like, again, some examples. And again, look at how, as Darren says, look at how this feels like work, right? immediately I'm doing a thing, I'm setting up a group, I'm organizing a workshop, I'm joining a group, I'm campaigning. You know, the teacher part of me reading this thinks, I haven't got time for this. I haven't got energy for this. And that is an absolutely reasonable position to take, of course. And it's interesting to take the view that you should see what's out there first before starting something yourself. And at least, you know, as all with most community endeavours, be aware of what's going on in this field. Think about linking up with other people who are doing similar kinds of things. You don't have to reinvent the wheel every time. I think the last one is interesting for me. This was a real example, not from me. Just go back one. The last example there, because some of this will be about people and people being blockers to action. And there are interesting complexities around, particularly university appointments, search committees, hiring, recruiting, retaining, to which many ideas can end up not passing through a certain person or people who act as gatekeepers. And that's important to start to think about as well. Okay, so let's move on to the next one. So this is, again, what the level 4 might look like or feel like or hear, or we might hear. So thinking about mathematics assessment, and, you know, this is Darren's subject, so I won't let him speak yet because we'll be here all day, but how different modalities of mathematics assessment, never mind the content, may or may not affect who has access to mathematics, whose views on mathematics or ways of practicing mathematics are privileged, culturally relevant pedagogy, ideas about how ethics, equity, access is deeply embedded in mathematics assessment through the ideas of values, what we value, and our values. And once you start to pick at that, it's a very interesting exercise. Then we've got thinking about using data more ethically. So again, our responsibility, I think, as mathematicians and maths teachers goes well beyond our maths classrooms, because most schools run on data, most universities run on data, most households these days run on data. And so the idea that we have power, and we do, as understanding of some of those concepts in much more detail than the average person, bears thinking about. How could we use that power? I'm sure Darren won't mind that an example of that is that we've been involved in union work, and one of the things that the union asked us to do is a huge statistical analysis of something. And because we had the stat skills, we were actually able to make quite a difference in that area. And that was empowering, useful work, which definitely had ethics embedded in it. A few other things there about publishers, and this is an interesting one, you know, because in education we're at the intersection of what we consider to be doing good and helping society, and then also commercial enterprise. And so publishers are often, you know, part of that intersection in an interesting way. And then we've got things like inviting parents, and then we've got things like mixed attainment versus setting, all of which, again, as maths educators, we are fairly uniquely placed to have some views on and potentially criticize in ways that are evidence-based and understanding of the underlying models. So, you know, I guess what I'm saying is as mathematicians, we're kind of superheroes in this arena, and maybe we need to recognize that. Over to you, Darren.
I think one final thing just to say on this set of examples, and in particular the mixed attainment classes one, because I suspect that people in the room will see that sentence and have a reaction to whether that's a good thing or not. And I think it's a great example of one of the extra things that we haven't really discussed up to this point around ethics, which is that, you know, whose ethics are we talking about here? Are we talking about the ethics based on my values? Are we talking about the ethics based on Lucy's values, or your values, or the government's values? And this question around mixed attainment is an interesting one to highlight, because I think people can make completely opposite arguments from an ethical standpoint about whether to do mixed attainment or not, based on their values and beliefs around education and what's the most supportive thing for the students they're dealing with, or for particular subsets of students, which tends to be how some of the discussion around mixed attainment then gets framed. And in those discussions, we're not talking about someone with ethics against someone without ethics. We're talking about people with contradictory ethical positions in a lot of cases. So that adds another layer of let's say, richness to the discussion around ethics, or challenge, problem, depending on how you want to frame it. Okay, So there has been quite a few bits and pieces going back and forward in the chat. So we'll just take a moment here. And I wonder if, Lucy, if there's anything in the chat that you'd like to draw attention to and read out, discuss.
Yeah, I mean, it's all great. And thank you, everybody, for your comments, which are really, really helpful. I think we've got a few ideas about who has popularized some of these ideas, and particular mathematicians, to name no names, are certainly, I'm not going to use the word guilty, are certainly responsible for perpetuating some of these views about mathematics. And I guess what's interesting is some of them were around during times when, you know, there was war and science being practiced, which were very much dependent on maths, and that's interesting as well. And then we've again got examples of Ronald Fisher and statistics. And I think, as Darren said, there's a point here about it might be the easier sell to say that there's ethical decisions embedded in statistics and statistics education. Maybe we feel more comfortable with that, and then generalize to maths education. That's one of the main arguments we make in the book. But really, the fact that Ronald Fisher used stats for to pursue a eugenicist point of view isn't about stats education. Actually, it's about science more generally. It's about mathematics more generally. It's about systems that we perceive to be scientific, reasoned, cold, neutral, whatever they are, and they aren't, because there's values embedded in them at every level. And I do think the argument extrapolates quite nicely. But I will leave Darren to say something on that, because I suspect he will.
I mean, I'm trying to avoid it because it's an excellent point, and I'm not sure it needs to be unpacked too much more. And there's other bits of stats as well. The other comment that's jumped out from me here, which I think is really interesting, is so I hope they don't mind me name checking, but it's C. Powell's in the chat by the look of it. So to move away from the idea of mathematics as neutral, maybe it would be useful to teach more of the history of mathematics to show how mathematics has been developed in response to social drivers, which is such a great point, and it's something that we talk about a lot in our day jobs, where we're looking about trying to sort of effectively map the landscape of maths and what students could encounter in their mathematics education. And we talk a lot about the place of these kind of ideas of history of maths in particular, and cultural elements of maths, and different ideas, different cultural ideas of mathematics, because we privilege a very Western perspective of what maths even is within our curricula. But I think it's really interesting just to think about this point in terms of how the conception of the adjacency between ethics and mathematics, how much it's a function of mathematics itself, and how much it's a function of how we conceive mathematics based on the structures of curriculum and assessment that we have, rather than mathematics as a thing, because school mathematics is a really weird and specific thing compared to mathematics, the idea. And so a lot of these opportunities for people to say, well, we can peel these kind of ethics and things out, it's not actually about maths, it's about how we've conceived the curriculum over, 100 years, 150 years, to get to this point where what we've got left in it is actually a very singular perspective on what maths is and what mathematical activity is, and is often not well aligned with the idea of mathematics being a mathematician and doing mathematics, is where some of these issues then arise from. This is something I could talk about for 20 minutes.
Yeah, I just want to pick up on Catalina's response to that, so that the idea that maths is made by humans can't be fully disjointed from humans' motivation context is it's what I believe. I think it's not certainly shared by everybody, and that's also fine, but I think it's beautifully expressed there. And I wonder if, Catalina, you have read Francis Su's Maths for Human Flourishing, which it feels like it's a really similar argument. Should we move forward, Darren, make sure we finish on time?
We probably should, because we are cracking through our time very quickly. We've only got about 10 minutes left if we're going to have some time to take questions at the end. So what we thought we'd do now is just to go through, and we'll do this relatively quickly and relatively light touch, some of the sites where we see ethics as particularly relevant to the conversations around mathematics. Now, we make no claim that these are the only ones, that these are the main ones, or that these are the most important ones. So they're really just to illustrate some ideas. And I hope what happens as a result of this is that you think, oh, but what about this? And what about this? And what about this? Rather than getting too focused on the examples that we're giving here as anything trying to represent being the last word on this. So really, these are just provocations just to try and situate some thinking. So the first one that kind of jumps out at us is modeling in particular. And the interesting thing about a model, there's two perspectives you can take on a model. You can talk about a model of a thing. And in some sense, you can reduce the importance of values and ethics within the model of a thing, although not take it away completely, because in the design of the model, you have to think about what is captured in terms of your values by the things that you're attending to in the design of that model. As soon as you start to move to a model for something, so I'm trying to answer some particular problem that has real world connotations by creating a model which gives me an output that allows me to make decisions, then immediately you're moving into a very ethical space, because a number of questions kind of appear at that point. Like if we're talking about using this model to say the best course of action, like best for who, whose interests are being served by the assumptions that went into building that model, best according to what criteria, what does success look like? Even simple things like, are we looking at applying one thing to everybody? Are we looking at trying to attend to the edge cases that come out of a model? Are we ignoring the edge cases because we've decided they're not important? There's so many values and ethical decisions that are wrapped up in that. We're talking about sort of normative models, like normal for who, and what's the implications of applying a normative model to a population that's not all fitting into that norm, and crucially, what kind of unintended harm might result. And we can see some examples of this from things that have happened very recently, which I think it's probably not too much of a stretch to go down. If you look at some of the problems that the new Labour government have got into around decisions on two-child benefit cap and the winter fuel allowance, which from a modeling perspective of thinking about, well, if we take this, we save this much money, we can invest that into other places elsewhere, you can make a good argument for. But there are unintended harms that also result from those decisions that on a spreadsheet perhaps look very good and solve a number of intractable problems and have benefits elsewhere. So what model and what considerations went into those decisions, that ultimately is an ethical conundrum around the actual model itself. We've talked about statistics quite a lot. I'm going to talk about it again from another point of view, primarily because statistics, again, is one of these things where there's a lot of research that suggests we just don't do it well. So there's a whole ethics side of the fact that we are reproducing work in classrooms and work in assessments that have been pretty much debunked as not a good way to teach statistics since early 90s and before. And we're still repeating that stuff because we haven't got a pipeline for change at scale into classrooms and into assessment. Some of this research that's been pushed out really highlights the importance of these stages of the statistical investigation cycle. If you've looked at the MEI specs for core maths or the A-level MEI specs as well, particularly, you'll have seen this kind of model within that documentation. But at each stage of the statistical cycle, there are ethical questions that you can ask. So some quick examples here. The very basic thing of, like, if you're doing statistics, you're collecting data. Why are you collecting the data? Like, whose needs are being served there? What's the question designed to answer? We've talked about people like Fisher already. Like, some of the questions they were trying to answer, not questions that perhaps we would be happy about the fact that they were even asking. How might the answers be used? What's the relationship between the person asking the question and the data source? start to look at research by the oil industry, by the tobacco industry going back years, and the funding behind research that found, smoking completely safe, and oil doesn't really have any impact on the environment. So the genesis of data, the genesis of the questions is ethical. Collection of data, again, who owns the data, how is it being used, how is it being shared, what's measured, how are we turning individuals into data, and what do we erase from their identity when we do that? Even down to very, in some ways, uncontroversial decisions about tick male or female on this questionnaire. Like, immediately that says something about the values of the person designing the questionnaire, and it says something to the individuals about norms and values of institutions, and either erases people or forces people to make particular choices and things. Again, in the interest of time, we won't spend too long on this, but just to kind of draw that attention, there's a few questions there, but there are endless questions you can start to ask when you begin thinking about the specifics of this. Okay, what are the ethical implications of this particular piece of maths? Lucy.
I'm going to wrap up very shortly for questions, and this might be a nice thing to have on the screen for questions. I think one of the things that people may say quite rightly in response to this framework is, okay, but what kind of things can I ask students? And can is very interesting there because it does sort of two things. One is what is possible to ask students, and another is what am I allowed to ask students? And as teachers, we are quite often constrained by the systems we're in, but also we are worried about implications, about consequences. And so I made this graphic to show that I think there are general questions which suit almost any topic. And then the top of the cupcake is the particular instantiation, expression, combination, which might happen in a very specific topic area. And these are topics that I've taught this way. And so I'm sorry the text is very small, but things like, what could a wrong but useful answer suggest here? You might not think is ethical at all, but it's very ethical in design because it starts to get at there are a plural number of answers. We don't just care about being right, whatever that might mean. Also, there's interest and value in methods, and we aren't just focused on right methods or right answers. Actually, there's interesting things that might happen. And similarly, things like in very specific topic areas, what might happen if we ignored outliers in this context? What does a fair share look like? Is it humane to tether animals? This is a very silly joke based on most of the questions that we've encountered about goats being tethered in order to map out various different loci. And so here's a few things, again, provocations for you to think about, and I think we should go to questions now.
Yes, hello. Sorry, it was taking a long time for the video to come up there. So yes, do we have any questions? I'll wrangle the questions. I did see there was one that was, it seemed to be going quite deeply here. Right? I'll find it. So should we start with this one? In mathematics, we know something about the importance of definitions and axioms, especially in the foundations. What are the equivalents in ethics? We have ideas in mathematics which are obvious, but, well, obvious in quotes, and which are obvious but are incorrect. And that's from Bill. I think that's, I can ask you that question, I think.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll say a bit about that, and then I'll say what I think about the responses, which are excellent. So firstly, yes, there absolutely is the equivalent in ethics, and its values. It's what do we value? So of course, if you study anything to do with ethics, ethical behavior, morals, and they're sort of very subtly different in philosophy, the idea is that there isn't a universal idea of good or harm. It's good for something, harm for something, good for certain people, harm for certain people. But you really have to define what you value. And so you may be aware of kind of the idea of utilitarianism, which is the idea that we value keeping people alive and keeping the most number of people alive for the longest amount of time, for example. And if you start from that premise, that value, it's a bit like logical reasoning in maths. You can say in any situation, I want to maximize keeping the largest number of people alive for the largest amount of time. And you can also quantify harm in that way as well, and that's a sort of framework that you can use. But that certainly isn't the only way to do ethics. And increasingly, we recognise in the real world, it's much more complex than that. And actually, our relationships matter. Who people are to us matter. Our proximity matters. You know, many experiments have shown that we don't care about people who are geographically or socially far away from us when actually we profess to care about them. There's some really interesting things there. So there's our stated values, and then there's our expressed values, and those would be the sorts of things that we build on in terms of logical arguments. But the way that philosophy and mathematics interact is just fascinating, so I won't go too far into it. What Laura said here I really like as a response. So one of the ways in which we can make our values explicit is to position ourselves as researchers with an element of subjectivity and not claim objectivity. And this is a feminist viewpoint, and it comes from feminist thinking. Ultimately, we say that instead of this study was conducted, I conducted this study, instead of these things are considered important, I consider these important, and why? And as a researcher, we position ourselves squarely within research. And that means that we're making explicit something which may previously have been implicit. We're not suddenly saying it's there and it wasn't there before. It was always there. We just pretended it didn't, because we like our research to be scientific and value-free and neutral. And you see the sort of parallels here. So I think that's an amazing point, very well made there. And something which we also have a bit of a talk about in the chapter, which is, and Darren, if you move forward 2 slides, this idea of the hidden ethics fallacy, which is the idea that you can pretend, you can opt out, pretend you don't have a position in ethics by saying, oh, that's not an ethical thing, or I'm not interested, or no, there's no ethics related to this problem. But that's a position. You're always taking a position, even when you profess to take no position, which is called the hidden ethics fallacy. So that's sort of my response to that. Darren, is there anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, I mean, just one more thing to say. I mean, I think it's a really interesting question, because in itself, it is exactly what we've been talking about. Saying like there are so many assumptions, and please don't take this as a criticism of the question or the person asking the question. There are so many assumptions just bound up in asking the question about, well, axioms are important in mathematics, and what do those axioms look like in this second? This is always the problem of talking about ethics. You just get into, like, you can go down huge rabbit holes of, but what does it really mean to say and think a really fine detailed thing? But I think it's worth just dwelling on and reflecting on whether there should be axioms of ethics, and whether actually this is something different. It's something human, it's something contextual and contested, and that's kind of the point, and it's always going to be the case. And so I guess the thing that I would say would be the axiom, if you like, is developing comfort with discomfort, and actually being prepared to sit in a space where you don't necessarily know the answers, and there may be lots of competing things, and you're trying to work out where you sit and where your values most well align. Because sometimes we have conflicting values, and when confronted with a real situation, you go, well, actually, if I do this thing which I think works with my values, it challenges some of these other things that I believe, and that's really uncomfortable, and so we tend to run away and not look at it again. And so that comfort with discomfort, I think, is a really fundamental starting point to then doing this sort of ethical work.
Okay, I think maybe we've got time for one more question. I mean, have you been checking the chat? And is there one you want to pick out there? Got 2 last questions.
Yes, I really like Catalina's question.
So if you want to answer that one then, please.
And I was just searching for the graphic from the book. So I can actually answer this with a picture. So the question being, if you have examples to teach the role of ethics and how we choose and state the assumptions in a model. And so we sort of gave an example in the book of designing new bus routes. And we talked about, if we were going to do things like establish the objective and the constraints of that activity, which users are we prioritizing? Whose constraints are we using and why? Is a solution even possible? And what compromises might we have to make? We then have to do things like gather data, choose a model and an algorithm, which absolutely is not value free. You know, who chose it, why? What are the assumptions and biases in the model itself? If AI is used, who's taking responsibility for those decisions? We've got to reconsider the assumptions once we engage with the stakeholders as well during the modelling process. So as we know, as mathematicians, we make all sorts of assumptions about things, and then we go into the real world and people say, oh no, you can't put a bus route there because or no, we won't use it if you put it there, thank you. And so this is the graphic that is part of the book that I'm referencing. And so if we sort of leave that on screen, we might be able to also address the other question, which is, you go ahead, Con.
Well, so I was just going to say on that, the other thing that I think he's into this is something that had we had a bit more time, we would have talked about a bit more, which is one of the things that we think about and talk about a lot is the idea of ethical micro decisions, because a lot of what we've talked here about the sort of the big things and the standout things, and actually key to this is just starting to recognize that every decision you make, for most decisions you make, have some kind of small ethical component. And once you start to think about that and start to consider what they are, then you start to find the opportunities to then explore them with students. So that idea of well, how might we start to talk about the ethics of creating a model and the assumptions and things, actually talk about those, like what are those micro decisions that are made? What are all the decision points within that model design and the interpretation? Like when you make a statement based on the model, what are you thinking about? What are the implications of that? And that constant, like, what are the micro decisions, these really tiny things that happen all the time, until it becomes a habit to some extent. And then you have a breakdown because you can't stop thinking about all of the implications of everything you do. Could
you just zoom in on the graphic a little? It's a bit hard to see. I just want to address the last question, which is a great one. Thank you very much. If we choose our own value systems, is there any way to come up with the right answer, or at least something objective?
Where am I zooming into?
Lovely, thank you. And does this depend on which value system we use, irrelevant of the logic? Yes. And so the value system might be considered to be the premises or the assumption. The logic stays the same. You need some logical system and you need some argumentation with, claims and warrants. But yes. And so my answer to, is there a way to come up with something objective? No, because ethics is not objective, neither is mathematics for me. And so I don't think such a thing exists. There isn't a right way to teach maths. There isn't a right way to make decisions in the real world. There isn't a right way to parent. These are all the decisions, as Darren says, that are embedded in all the kind of micro-ethical dilemmas. And so all I can do is try and be internally consistent, but also consistent with my value system. So I might say, I think it's really, really important that everyone feels welcome in my maths classroom, which, by the way, most teachers say and most schools say, but their decisions don't follow on from that. What they do quite often is the opposite of that. And maybe that's unintentional, but needs examining. Quite often we inadvertently make some students feel unwelcome in our maths classrooms. We inadvertently deprivilege certain ways of engaging with or practicing mathematics because we don't know any better, because we learned it ourselves, and multitude of reasons, and no blame. But just thinking about the way we do that differently, and it's inherently subjective, not objective. And I think that's the problem. We try to make it objective when it just isn't.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, I'd just like to thank you both for an excellent talk. I mean, that was very thought-provoking. I'm going to try and work out how I can include this in my lectures in group theory and so on.
Yeah.
So could we show our appreciation? The reaction buttons now seem to be labeled with a heart. So there's one where you can.
It seems slightly biased, doesn't it?
So yes, I'm seeing a round of applause now. So thank you very much. So and thanks for everybody for coming along. We'll see you at the next one, which I've forgotten the date for, but there's one in December. So thank you very much.